Alright, folks, we're going to go through how to use the UV vis spectrometer. It's a bit of an introduction, so by now you've written the method, you're thinking about using UV vis, and we're going to go through how we actually go about it. So the first thing, we call this a UV vis spectrometer, but this one here doesn't actually go into the UV range, so you're basically looking at anything from around 800 nanometers, which you can see here on the dial. It says a little bit higher, but it probably up around 900, and it will go all the way down, and it says here down to about 340, but you're probably lucky to find anything decent below around 350. So that wavelength range that we just talked about, that's all in the visible range, and so in the visible ranges, rule of thumb is if it's coloured, and you can see that it's coloured, and the colour change is going to change with concentration, then this will get your results, this one here. Some samples that you've got things with double bonds in them, organic aromatic compounds, they'll actually detect below that 350 nanometers and maybe around 200, 250. 280, we do have a machine that will actually go into the UV range, but it's one machine that we've got which science staff can operate, and we do allow some students to design around that. The only thing is if you're going to go below about 350 nanometers, then you've got to use crystal cuvettes, and those crystal cuvettes are about $400 each, so we just kind of we restrict access to that. Right, first thing you want to do when you come in is you want to turn on your machine on the side there, and it will start to warm up. Now there's a monochromatic light source inside here, and that monochromatic light source also needs to warm up, and you're better off making sure the first thing you should do before you start setting up is just turn it on, because after 20 minutes or so you'll get much more accurate readings than if you just start right from the word go. So turn it on first. Okay, I'm going to come back to the machine, but I'm going to go through a little bit of theory before I go any further. So there's three main stages to collecting data from UV vis. The first stage is called a maximum absorbance curve. Okay, so very simply what we're doing here is we're going to be putting a sample through the machine. This one just happens to be water, but we can pretend it's any kind of sample. And it will absorb at a particular wavelength. In fact, it won't absorb at one wavelength. It'll absorb at a whole range of wavelengths if it's coloured, but it'll absorb most strongly at one particular wavelength. And so we want to find out what that wavelength is. Now, if we're using the more advanced machine next door that I was talking about before, you can press a button and it will just automatically scan all the wavelengths, so it's quite nice. It's a little bit more labour intensive here on the ones that most people will be using, so I'll show you how you would go about doing that. Have we got another cuvette here? Guys, no, just the one. Okay, we'll have to make do with this one for now. So, first thing is, obviously the cuvette doesn't go in here just on its own. It's got to go in a cuvette cradle, in these ones here. And when you place it, when you're handling these things, you'll notice, I'll come up nice and close, there's a little arrow on the front. You can handle the cuvettes on the side, but this front face and the back face needs to be totally clean, because that's where the light source is going to go through. So what you do, you put it in the cradle, and you put it in the cradle so that the arrow is sitting at the front there. And then what you do, the arrow now will be facing the left-hand side, and you just slide it down into that cuvette holder. Cool. Always need to close the cuvette door so that it's totally dark in there. And it'll come up by default, it'll be on transmittance there. For most people, you can measure transmittance, but most people will probably work with absorbance in most IAs, so you'll change it there to absorbance, okay? Now what we've just put in there is not our sample. It's everything except what we're trying to test. So in this case here, if I was dissolving copper sulfate, for example, pretty blue colour, if I was dissolving that in water, I would actually just put water in my blank cuvette. But it's equally possible that I could be dissolving copper sulfate in a 50-50 mix of, say, ethanol and water. So what has to go in your blank then? The 50-50 mix of ethanol and water. So that's how you do it. Now the very first thing we do need to do, just like zeroing a mass balance, we need to zero this. And if you press 100% adjust, it'll go down to 0. It should go down to 0, but you'll notice that it hasn't quite gone down to 0, so I'm going to press 100% adjust again, and it's on 0. Now what we can do is we can take that out. I'm going to pretend I've got another cuvette. Pretend this is the copper sulfate one now. Put the copper sulfate one in, and we're going to get a reading. And that reading will hopefully tell us the copper sulfate. Now, what's just happened is quite interesting, all right? It's worth mentioning. Obviously, that was the same sample that I put in before, and I did 100% adjust. So logic tells you that should have gone back down to 0, but it hasn't gone back to 0. And I think the reason for that is that monochromatic light source is still warming up, so we're still getting variation in those readings. So that kind of stresses the importance of warming up the monochromatic light source. But if that was the case, let's press 100%, adjust again. There we go, we've got to go back to 0. Let's just see now if we put it back in. Pretty good. Okay, so that's pretty close to
there we go.
Back to 0. My hint on these machines would be to keep putting in your blank. In theory, you only have to put your blank in once, press 100% adjust, and it will hold through all your samples. But I know for a fact that these machines will drift. They're getting a bit old now. They've had some hard life over the last few years, so make sure that you keep putting your blank in every now and again and just keep zeroing it, or even between every sample. So now, assume I'm putting my sample back in after blanking it, and what I want to do is I want to get a reading, and if you just capture there that 340 nanometers, so I'm starting from the very first reading. And then what I would do is I would dial this up now to say 350 or 360, and I would repeat that process and repeat that process, and what I'll end up with is I'll end up getting a reading at every wavelength, and it's up to you whether you want to go up in 10 nanometers at a time or 20 nanometers. Obviously going up in 10 would be more accurate, but also more time consuming as well. So you'll end up with a curve that will look something like this.
Oh, that's
I'll end up with a curve, and let's say, for example, it was copper sulfate. I don't know, we're probably thinking up around maybe 600 or something. I can't remember exactly where it absorbs, but you could end up with a curve, something that'll look like this, and you'll end up with a peak, and you might get another little peak somewhere, or something like this. Okay. Now, in theory, if you set it at this peak, it will work. But this is what we call the area of maximum absorbance. It's where you're getting the biggest, sharpest peak. And obviously it's quite nice that it drops off steeply on either side of that peak. So from now on, well, this might be 580 there, for example. From now on, we're actually saying that our area of maximum absorbance in this sample is 580 nanometers, which by the way isn't the peak for copper sulfate, but we'll just say 580 nanometers. And from now on, what we're saying is, if we want to test the concentration of this particular solution, we're going to always do it at 580 nanometers. And that's really what we're doing with the maximum absorbance curve. You can also look at that up online. You can find out what the wavelength of maximum absorbance is. But the reason why you're better off doing it yourself is because on our machine, it might vary slightly from what the literature value actually says. All right, so that's stage 1. Stage 2. You want a calibration curve. Now, the purpose of the calibration curve, you'll notice here on this screen, the only value you get is absorbance. Now, every now and again, people will do an IA and they'll have no way of knowing what the true concentration is. So what they'll do is they'll just compare the relative absorbances. And if that's the case, it's okay. You won't have a calibration curve. But in most cases, like for example with copper sulfate, you're not really interested in what the absorbance is. You want to know what is the concentration of copper sulfate. So it's about drawing a link. So let's set up a hypothetical situation. This. And let's say that you have some kind of, well, let's say some kind of electrolysis or something like that. And in this electrolysis, in some shape or form, you're producing copper 2 plus iron. So this is the water that you're actually testing and that you want to find out the amount of copper 2 plus ions in. You can get absorbance readings for this, but what you want is concentration readings. So you won't know what the concentration is, but you may be fairly confident that it will be somewhere in a range between, say, 100 ppm and 1000 ppm. So you take some guesses. You go, well, I don't know what my results are going to come out as, but I'm pretty sure they're going to fall somewhere in between that range. So once you've taken a guesstimation of what you think your range will be, you say, well, okay, I'm going to make up some standards of copper sulfate, and I'm going to make them up really accurately. I'm going to make them up in a range between 100 and 1000. So you might go 100 ppm, and by the way, they might not be in ppm, they might be in moles per litre or grams per litre or whatever, but I've just chosen ppm. You might go 300, you might go 500, you might go 700, and you might finish at, say, 900, okay? Now, what you've got to do is you've got to go to the lab at this stage and you've got to get some copper sulfate. You've got to do some calculations to work out the mass you need to make up 100 ppm and 300 ppm, and you use your standard flasks and all those techniques that we taught you in Year 10 and 11 on how to make up a standard solution, and you make sure that you've got these really accurate solutions. And then what you do, using the process that we showed you before, you come to your wavelength and you say, well, okay, 580 is what I'm going to test it at. And you go to 580, set it up there, okay? Don't let anybody touch that, just go, right, it's always at 580. And then what you do is you once again get your blank, put your blank in, temperamental, there you go, you do your blank. And then what you do is you get your 100 ppm solution, you put your 100 ppm solution in, you get a reading. This is going to go back, it's drifting a lot, isn't it? You put your 100 ppm solution in and you get a result. You put your 300 in, you get a result, etc, etc. And then once you've got that, you'll end up with a graph that looks something like this. Concentration here for us, of course, is your copper sulfate solution. And you'll find that at 100 ppm, it might be here, at 300 it'll be here, 500 here, 700, and then say 900. But it should be a linear relationship. You should get a straight line, and then if you put a line of best fit through that, you now have your calibration curve. And what the calibration curve enables you to do is test your samples now, but you're doing exactly the process that we did before about zeroing a blank and then putting your sample in. But you have this at the core of your interpretation of your samples, because when you put your samples in, you'll just get an absorbance, but then you go back to this calibration curve and you go, well, okay, if I get an absorbance of value here, I can read across there and then go down, and then I can work out exactly what the concentration of that unknown sample is. So the calibration curve is the bridge between the absorbance and the concentration of your unknown samples. And that, folks, that's the UV Viz. So I hope that gives you an idea of how to use it. If you have any questions, just come and see us and we'll help you out with it. These machines, every now and again, they do play up. If you're having problems with one, maybe try one of the other machines, or if you're in serious doubts, we might be able to put a sample through the other UVBs just to confirm your data over here. Alright, now any questions from either of you guys, because you might have thought of something that I forgot to say in the video?